The Velrathi Dominion had ruled the stars for longer than most species could remember. Their warships were massive and dark, built to inspire fear before firing a single shot. In less than 100 years, they had conquered 17 star systems and enslaved billions of beings across the galaxy. No one had ever stopped them. No one had ever tried. High Commander Xyrith stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Conquest, and watched the stars pass by on the viewing screen. He was tall even by Velrathi standards, with gray, scaled skin and 4 arms that ended in sharp claws. His eyes were black and cold, the eyes of someone who had never known defeat. His fleet of 200 warships moved through space like a swarm of predators hunting for prey. Their sensors had detected something interesting. A small blue planet circled an ordinary yellow star in a quiet corner of the galaxy. The planet was called Earth by the creatures who lived there. Xyrith studied the information his scouts had gathered. The beings on Earth called themselves humans. They were soft and fragile, with only 2 arms and no natural weapons. They had only recently learned to travel beyond their own world, and their spacecraft were slow and primitive. Most amusing of all, they spent much of their time fighting wars against each other over small pieces of their own planet. The High Commander made a sound that was his species' way of laughing. This conquest would be easy. He would add Earth to his collection and move on within a single lunar cycle. The humans would surrender or they would die. It made no difference to him which they chose. On Earth, it was a cool autumn evening in California when Dr. Lisa Morgan first noticed something strange. She worked at the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, a place filled with giant radio dishes that listened to signals from across the universe. Lisa was 34 years old with short brown hair and tired eyes from too many late nights staring at computer screens. She had been drinking her 3rd cup of coffee when her equipment detected an unusual pattern. At first, she thought it was a glitch. Then the pattern repeated. Then it grew stronger. Lisa set down her coffee and leaned closer to her screen. Her heart began to beat faster. The signal was not random space noise. It was not a natural phenomenon. It was a transmission, and it was getting closer. Lisa picked up her phone and called her supervisor. Within 1 hour, the President of the United States had been informed. Within 3 hours, every major government on Earth knew the truth. Aliens were coming, and they would arrive within days. Captain Jack Sullivan received the news while eating dinner with his family in Virginia. He was 42 years old, a career military man with gray appearing in his dark hair and a face that showed the weight of many difficult decisions. He kissed his wife and 2 children goodbye and drove through the night to the Pentagon. The command center was already crowded when he arrived. Screens covered every wall, showing satellite images and data streams that made little sense to most of the people present. Colonel Maria Santos met him at the door. She was a small woman with sharp features and even sharper intelligence. "The aliens have entered our solar system," she told him. 200 ships? Maybe more. They passed Jupiter an hour ago. Jack felt his stomach tighten, but his face remained calm. He had trained his whole life for impossible situations. He had just never expected one quite this impossible. Dr. Nathan Price joined them moments later. He was the nation's leading expert on the possibility of alien life, a man who had written books and given lectures about this very scenario. Now that it was actually happening, he looked pale and frightened like everyone else. The alien fleet took position in orbit around the moon. From there, they broadcast a message to every communication device on Earth. The message was translated into every human language, a demonstration of how long the Velrathi had been watching and studying. The message was simple. Surrender unconditionally within 72 hours or face complete destruction. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. The Velrathi had given this same message to 17 other worlds, and all of them had either submitted or been reduced to ash. Panic spread across Earth like wildfire. People ran through streets, screaming. Others hid in their homes and prayed to whatever gods they believed in. Governments held emergency meetings that lasted through the night. Military leaders argued about options that did not exist. Jack Sullivan stood in the command center and watched the chaos unfold on dozens of screens. He thought about his children sleeping in their beds, unaware that their world might end in 3 days. He thought about every soldier he had ever commanded, every battle he had ever fought. None of it had prepared him for this, but something else stirred inside him too. Something older and deeper than fear. It was the same feeling his ancestors had known when they faced impossible odds and refused to quit. It was stubbornness. It was pride. It was the simple human refusal to accept defeat. Colonel Santos appeared beside him. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Jack watched the alien fleet on the screen, those dark shapes hanging in space like a death sentence. He thought about the message they had sent, so confident and so certain that humanity would bend. "We fight," he said. "We find a way to hurt them. And we fight until we cannot fight anymore." Maria nodded slowly. She had expected that answer. Deep down, she had hoped for it. Across the world, other people were reaching the same conclusion. In Moscow and Beijing, in London and Tokyo, in small villages and massive cities, humans looked up at the sky and felt something ancient wake inside them. They had survived ice ages and plagues. They had survived world wars and natural disasters. They had clawed their way up from caves to skyscrapers through sheer, stubborn will. The Velrathi had conquered species that surrendered. They had destroyed species that ran. But they had never encountered a species that simply refused to accept the situation. When the 72 hours ended, High Commander Zyrith waited for the surrender transmission. Instead, he received something else entirely. A single message from the United Governments of Earth. "The answer is no. Come and take our world if you can." Zyrith stared at the message for a long moment. Then he laughed again. That cold, rasping sound. The primitives had chosen death. He would be happy to deliver it. He gave the order to advance, not knowing that he had just made the worst mistake in Velrathi history. Earth was about to teach the galaxy a lesson it would never forget. The world had spoken with one voice for the first time in human history. It was not a voice of fear or surrender. It was a voice of defiance that echoed from every corner of the planet. In the hours after Earth sent its response to the Velrathi, something remarkable happened. Old enemies became allies. Nations that had pointed weapons at each other for decades suddenly found common ground. Political leaders who had never agreed on anything discovered they could agree on this. Earth would not fall without a fight. General Frank Morrison was chosen to lead the Earth Defense Coalition. He was 61 years old, a tall man with white hair and a face carved from years of hard service. He had fought in 3 wars and had the scars to prove it. When they asked him to take command, he did not hesitate. His first order was simple but important: buy time and learn everything possible about the enemy. Humanity had no chance in a direct fight against Velrathi technology, so they needed to be clever. They needed to find weaknesses. Lieutenant Commander Beth Turner became his chief tactical advisor. She was 38 years old with red hair and a mind that worked faster than most computers. She had spent her career studying naval warfare, but space combat was not so different. It was still about positioning, timing, and knowing your enemy better than they knew you. Beth proposed a daring plan. Using modified satellites and whatever spacecraft they could launch quickly, they would study the alien fleet while making Earth appear stronger than it actually was. False signals, decoy installations, anything to make the Velrathi pause and reconsider their easy conquest. Meanwhile, Dr. Claire Davidson led a team of scientists at MIT who worked without sleep to understand the alien transmissions. Claire was only 32 years old, but she was already considered one of the brightest minds on Earth. She had curly dark hair that she never bothered to brush and glasses that were always smudged. After 40 hours of nonstop work, her team made a breakthrough. They cracked enough of the Velrathi communication codes to listen to enemy transmissions. What they learned changed everything. The Velrathi had never faced real resistance. Every species they encountered either surrendered immediately or collapsed within days of the first attack. They had no strategy for a long fight because they had never needed one. Their entire military doctrine was based on quick, overwhelming force against enemies who gave up. Claire rushed this information to General Morrison. "If we can survive the first wave," she told him, "we might actually have a chance. They do not know how to handle an enemy that keeps fighting." The general nodded slowly as he absorbed this knowledge. It was not much, but it was something. A small crack in the armor of an unstoppable enemy. Across the world, ordinary people stepped forward to help in ways no one expected. Kevin Park was a tech billionaire who had built his fortune creating satellite networks. He donated every satellite he owned to the defense effort and flew to Washington to personally help reprogram them. Laura Chen ran an aerospace company that had been developing experimental propulsion systems. Her technology was years away from being ready, but she opened her laboratories to military engineers and told them to take whatever they needed. In Germany, a retired physicist named Hans Weber remembered research he had abandoned decades ago. It involved manipulating electromagnetic fields in ways that might disrupt alien sensors. He called his old students and they began working in his basement. In Japan, a team of robotics experts started building drones that could be launched in massive swarms. In Brazil, mining engineers figured out how to quickly dig deep underground shelters. In Australia, farmers organized communication networks that did not rely on technology the aliens might destroy. Humanity was doing what it had always done when faced with extinction. It was adapting, improvising, and refusing to accept the inevitable. Captain Jack Sullivan coordinated the military response from the Pentagon. He slept only 2 hours each night, surviving on coffee and determination. Colonel Santos worked beside him, translating intelligence into actionable plans. The alien fleet began moving toward Earth 3 days after the deadline passed. High Commander Zyreth was in no hurry. He wanted the humans to watch his ships approaching, to feel the dread growing with each passing hour. Fear was a weapon too, but as his fleet drew closer, strange things began to happen. Sensors showed military installations that should not exist. Communication intercepts suggested defense systems far more advanced than initial scans had indicated. Decoy satellites broadcast false signals that made human forces appear 10 times larger than they actually were. Zyreth was not worried, but he was confused. His intelligence had shown a primitive, divided world. Now that world appeared to be unified and surprisingly well prepared. Perhaps the conquest would take slightly longer than expected. He did not realize that every day of delay was a victory for Earth. Every hour gave humanity more time to prepare, to learn, to build. Lieutenant Commander Turner watched the alien fleet on her tactical display and allowed herself a small smile. The Velrathi were slowing down, becoming cautious. Her deception was working. On the 5th day, General Morrison addressed the world through every available broadcast channel. His face appeared on screens from New York to New Delhi, from Cairo to Tokyo. "They are coming," he said simply. "They expect us to run, or hide, or beg for mercy. They have never met a species like us. They do not understand what we are capable of when our backs are against the wall." He paused and looked directly into the camera. "We will lose people. We will lose cities. This will be the hardest fight our species has ever faced. But we will not lose our freedom. We will not lose our future. We will show these invaders that Earth is not just another conquest. Earth is where empires come to die." Across the planet, people watched and listened. Fear was still there. But something else was growing alongside it. Pride. Determination. A stubborn refusal to go quietly. High Commander Zyreth received translations of the speech and dismissed it as empty words. Every doomed species made brave speeches before the end. Words meant nothing against superior firepower. He ordered his fleet to begin the invasion. Landing craft filled with Velrathi soldiers launched toward Earth like metal rain falling from the sky. The battle for humanity had begun, and the aliens were about to learn that some species were simply too stubborn to conquer. The first Velrathi landing craft touched down in the American Midwest on a Tuesday morning. The sky was gray and heavy with clouds, as if the Earth itself knew what was coming. 300 alien soldiers emerged from their ship into the golden wheat fields of Kansas, expecting to find frightened farmers running for their lives. Instead, they found Sergeant Ryan Brooks and 200 American soldiers dug into defensive positions that had been prepared for days. Ryan was 29 years old, a farm boy himself who had joined the army because he wanted to see the world. Now the world was coming to him. The first battle lasted 6 hours. The Velrathi had better weapons and stronger armor. Their plasma rifles could cut through walls and their shields could stop most human bullets, but they had never fought enemies who kept attacking even when they should have retreated. They had never faced soldiers who dragged wounded friends to safety while still firing their weapons. They had never encountered farmers with hunting rifles who joined the fight because this was their land and they would not give it up. When the smoke cleared, 140 humans were dead. But so were 93 Velrathi soldiers, more than they had lost in their entire previous campaign across 17 star systems. High Commander Xyreth received the battle report with disbelief. He read it 3 times before accepting that the numbers were accurate. These primitive humans had actually hurt his forces. It was impossible, and yet it had happened. He ordered 5 more landing craft to reinforce the area. He would crush this resistance with overwhelming numbers. But the same story repeated across the planet. In the mountains of Switzerland, in the jungles of Vietnam, in the deserts of North Africa, human defenders fought with everything they had. They used terrain the aliens did not understand. They set traps and ambushes. They attacked at night when Velrathi sensors worked poorly. They refused to fight fair because survival was more important than honor. Captain Amy Patterson flew sorties over occupied territory in her modified fighter jet. She was 34 years old with short blonde hair and reflexes that had made her the best pilot in her squadron. Her aircraft could not match Velrathi ships in space, but in the atmosphere of Earth, where she knew every wind, current, and cloud pattern, the fight was different. She led pilots from 12 nations in attacks against alien supply lines. They struck fast and disappeared before the enemy could respond. When the Velrathi adapted their tactics, Amy adapted hers. It was a deadly game of chess, played at supersonic speeds. The resistance was not only military. Across the world, ordinary people found ways to fight back that the aliens never expected. Dr. Paul Henderson was a 67-year-old retired chemist from Ohio. His specialty had been industrial solvents. Not exactly exciting work, but when he studied captured footage of Velrathi soldiers, he noticed something about their environmental suits. The seals were made of a polymer that would break down when exposed to certain common chemicals. He mixed up a batch of his special compound in his kitchen and gave the formula to the military. Within days, soldiers were throwing bottles of the stuff at enemy positions and watching alien suits fail in the harsh Earth atmosphere. Linda Martinez was a high school science teacher in Texas. She was 52 years old and had spent decades teaching teenagers about electromagnetic waves. When she examined the frequencies the Velrathi used for communication, she realized they were vulnerable to interference from modified radio equipment. She wrote instructions that could be followed by anyone with basic electronics knowledge and posted them online. Within a week, resistance fighters around the world were jamming alien communications using homemade devices built from old radio parts. Eric Walsh was only 19 years old, a college student who spent most of his time playing video games and writing code. He gathered a group of fellow hackers from 6 different countries who had never met in person. Working together through encrypted channels, they found a way to infiltrate Velrathi computer systems through captured equipment. They could not take control of enemy ships, but they could cause confusion. They crashed navigation systems on 3 transport vessels, sending them into mountains. They scrambled targeting data during critical moments. They turned the aliens' own technology against them. The Velrathi took cities, but they could not hold them. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a killing ground. Civilians who had never held a weapon learned to shoot. Children carried messages between resistance cells. Old women hid soldiers in their basements. The invasion that was supposed to take weeks dragged on for months. Sergeant Brooks fought in a dozen battles across the American heartland. He was wounded twice and refused to leave the front lines. The men and women under his command followed him because he never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. He ate the same bad food, slept in the same cold trenches, and bled on the same ground. High Commander Xyreth grew increasingly frustrated. His casualties were mounting at an unacceptable rate. He had lost more soldiers on this single backward planet than in all his previous conquests combined. His subordinates were beginning to whisper that perhaps this invasion had been a mistake. Xyreth silenced the whispers by executing 2 of his own officers. Then he made a decision that would define the war. If the humans would not surrender, he would burn their cities from orbit. He would turn their precious Earth into a smoking ruin and claim victory over the ashes. He ordered his fleet to begin orbital bombardment of major population centers. The first targets would be New York, London, Tokyo, and Moscow. But General Morrison had anticipated this moment. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, hidden from alien sensors, a secret project had been underway since the first week of the invasion. It was called Project Longshot, and it represented humanity's last desperate hope. The project combined salvaged alien technology with human engineering and pure, stubborn creativity. It was risky and probably suicidal. But it was the only chance they had. As Velrothi warships positioned themselves to rain fire on human cities, Morrison gave the order to accelerate the timeline. Project Longshot would launch in 48 hours, whether it was ready or not. The fate of Earth would be decided by a handful of volunteers willing to give everything for a chance at victory. Dr. Alan Foster had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in 6 months. His eyes were red, and his hands shook from too much coffee. But his mind was still sharp enough to see what others had missed. He was 45 years old, a physicist who had spent his career studying theoretical energy systems. Now he was studying something far more practical. The captured Velrothi power cores sat in his laboratory like metal hearts torn from dead giants. His team had taken them apart piece by piece, scanning every component, testing every circuit. Most of what they found was beyond human understanding, technology that would take decades to reverse engineer. But Alan had found something else, a flaw, a weakness so fundamental that he could hardly believe the Velrothi had overlooked it. Their ships drew power from centralized reactors linked through a network. Each ship shared energy with the others, making the fleet stronger as a whole. But this connection worked both ways. If one reactor was forced into overload, the feedback would cascade through the entire network. The pulse would travel from ship to ship like lightning through a chain of metal. One overload could cripple the entire fleet. Alan brought his discovery to General Morrison on a morning when enemy bombardment had already begun on 3 continents. The general listened carefully, his weathered face showing nothing of what he felt inside. "How do we trigger this overload?" he asked. Alan explained. "Someone would need to board the command ship and reach its central reactor. They would need to plant a device that would force the reactor beyond its safety limits. The pulse generator was small enough to carry, but getting it to the target would be nearly impossible. And whoever does this," Morrison said quietly, "they would not survive." Alan shook his head. The cascade would begin within seconds of activation. There would be no time to escape. Morrison was silent for a long moment. Then he called Colonel Santos into the room and told her to find volunteers for a mission with no return. The word spread through military channels within hours. A suicide mission with a chance to save Earth. No pressure, no requirements. Just volunteers who understood what they were signing up for. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of soldiers from every nation offered their lives. Choosing among them was the hardest thing Colonel Santos had ever done. Sergeant Ryan Brooks was selected first. He had fought in more battles than anyone else and had proven he could handle anything. When Santos told him the mission parameters, he simply nodded and asked when they were leaving. Captain Amy Patterson volunteered the moment she heard about the mission. She was one of the few pilots skilled enough to navigate a stolen alien shuttle through enemy defenses. Without her, the team would never reach the command ship. Lieutenant Henry Cole was a demolitions expert from Britain who had spent the war blowing up alien installations. He was quiet and serious. The kind of man who measured his words carefully because he knew the weight they carried. He would be responsible for arming the pulse generator. Specialist Nicole Grant was the youngest member of the team at 24 years old. She was a combat medic from Chicago who had saved dozens of lives under fire. Her job would be to keep the team alive long enough to complete their objective. 8 others joined them. Soldiers from Germany, Japan, Brazil, Australia, Kenya, India, Poland, and Canada. 12 people from 12 nations, united by a single purpose. General Morrison met with them the night before launch. He looked at their faces, so young and so determined. and felt the weight of what he was asking them to do. "You know what this mission means," he said. "You know the odds. I will not pretend there is hope for survival because there is not. What I can tell you is that if you succeed, you will have saved more lives than any soldiers in human history. Your names will be remembered as long as humanity exists." Sergeant Brooks spoke for the group. "We understand, sir. We are ready." The mission launched at dawn, under cover of a massive global counterattack. Every remaining aircraft, every missile, every weapon humanity possessed, was thrown at the Velrathi fleet to create chaos and distraction. Cities that had been hiding their defenses revealed everything they had left. Captain Patterson piloted the stolen shuttle through a storm of plasma fire and debris. She flew like a woman possessed, dodging shots that should have been impossible to avoid, threading through gaps that barely existed. The shuttle took damage but kept flying. On the command ship, High Commander Zyrith watched the human counterattack with contempt. They were throwing everything at his fleet in a desperate final gesture. It was pitiful, and it was pointless. He did not notice the small shuttle approaching until it was too late. The strike team breached the hull through a maintenance port that alien security had ignored. They were inside the biggest ship in the Velrathi fleet, surrounded by thousands of enemies, with no way out. They moved through corridors designed for alien bodies, crouching and crawling through spaces too small for Velrathi soldiers to follow easily. Lieutenant Cole led the way with a scanner showing the path to the reactor chamber. They encountered resistance almost immediately. Sergeant Brooks took point, his weapon firing in controlled bursts that dropped enemies before they could raise an alarm. When his rifle ran dry, he used his sidearm. When his sidearm emptied, he used his knife. One by one, the team fell. The soldier from Kenya died holding a doorway so others could pass. The woman from Japan was killed, disabling a security system. The man from Brazil gave his life drawing fire away from his teammates. By the time they reached the reactor chamber, only Brooks and Nicole Grant were still standing. Both were wounded, leaving trails of blood on the alien floor. The reactor was a massive structure that hummed with enough power to level mountains. Lieutenant Cole was dead, so Brooks would have to arm the device himself. Nicole covered the entrance as Velrathi soldiers closed in. She fired until her weapon clicked empty, then pulled her sidearm and kept firing. She was buying seconds with her life, and she knew exactly what those seconds were worth. Brooks attached the pulse generator to the reactor core with bleeding fingers. The device was simple to activate, just 2 switches and a button. He flipped the first switch. Enemy fire hit Nicole and she fell. Brooks flipped the second switch. He looked at the button that would end his life and save his world. He thought of his family, his friends, everyone he had ever known. Then he thought of the soldiers who had died getting him here, and the billions of people waiting on Earth below. His last transmission was broadcast across both fleets, heard by human and Velrathi alike. "Earth is not yours to take." He pressed the button. The pulse ripped through the Velrathi fleet like a wave of destruction that could not be stopped. It started in the command ship, a surge of energy that overloaded every system in seconds. Then it jumped to the next ship through the power network. Then the next. Then the next. High Commander Zyrith had exactly 3 seconds to understand what was happening. He watched his bridge controls explode in showers of sparks. He heard the screams of his crew as the lights failed. He felt the deck shake beneath his feet as the great engines of his flagship died. His last thought was disbelief. The primitives had beaten him. Then the reactor containment failed, and the eternal conquest became an expanding ball of fire in Earth orbit. Across the fleet, ships that had terrorized 17 star systems went dark, one after another. Some exploded immediately as their reactors overloaded. Others drifted powerless, their crews trapped in metal coffins. The cascade traveled through every vessel in the network, sparing nothing. On Earth, people watched the sky light up with secondary explosions. They did not understand what was happening at first. Then the reports started coming in from military command centers around the world. The enemy fleet was destroyed. Humanity had won. General Morrison received the news in his underground bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. His staff erupted in cheers and tears, months of fear and tension releasing all at once. Morrison allowed himself a single moment of relief before the weight of what came next settled on his shoulders. They had survived, but the cost had been staggering. Millions of people were dead across every continent. Cities lay in ruins from orbital bombardment and ground combat. The infrastructure that modern civilization depended on had been shattered. It would take years, perhaps decades, to rebuild. But they were free. That was what mattered most. The surviving Velrathi vessels, those few ships that had been too far from the fleet to be connected to the power network, fled toward the edge of the solar system. They carried with them stories that would spread across the galaxy. Stories of a blue planet inhabited by beings who could not be conquered. Stories of a species that fought with a ferocity that defied all logic and reason. The tale of Earth became a warning whispered among the stars. Do not go there. Do not provoke them. The humans would rather burn their own world than surrender it. They are too stubborn, too fierce, too absolutely unwilling to quit. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt. The technology salvaged from Velrathi wreckage accelerated human development by centuries. Engineers studied alien power systems and created energy sources that had seemed impossible before the war. Scientists examined alien medicine and found cures for diseases that had plagued humanity for generations. More importantly, the world remained united. The cooperation that had formed during the invasion did not fade when the threat ended. Nations that had been enemies realized they worked better as partners. The Earth Defense Coalition evolved into a true global government, imperfect but functional. Captain Jack Sullivan became Admiral Sullivan, commander of the first human deep space fleet. His flagship was named the Defiance, a word that had come to symbolize everything humanity had proven about itself. The ship was built using a combination of human engineering and alien technology, faster and stronger than anything the old Velrathi had possessed. Its crew came from every nation on Earth, selected from millions of volunteers who wanted to explore the stars their ancestors had once only dreamed about. On the bridge of the Defiance, Admiral Sullivan kept a small memorial display. 12 names were engraved on a simple metal plate. Sergeant Ryan Brooks, Captain Amy Patterson, Lieutenant Henry Cole, Specialist Nicole Grant, and 8 others whose sacrifice had saved their species. Sullivan looked at those names every day before beginning his duties. He never wanted to forget what their victory had cost. Dr. Lisa Morgan, the astronomer who had first detected the alien fleet, became Earth's ambassador to the galactic community. She traveled to distant worlds and met species that had cowered before the Velrathi for generations. Her message to every civilization she encountered was simple and powerful. Humanity would be a friend to the peaceful. They would trade knowledge and share resources with any species that approached them with goodwill. But they would be a nightmare to any who sought to enslave others. The Velrathi had learned this lesson, and humanity would teach it again to anyone who needed reminding. The reputation of Earth spread farther than any ship could travel. Enslaved populations on Velrathi-controlled worlds heard rumors of the species that had destroyed the invincible fleet. Some began to hope, some began to resist. Rebellions sparked across the Old Dominion, inspired by the example of a small blue planet that had refused to kneel. Within 50 years, the Velrathi Empire collapsed entirely. Without their fleet to enforce obedience, their subject species rose up and claimed their freedom. The great dominion that had ruled 17 star systems became a footnote in galactic history. Remembered only as the empire that had been broken by humans, new civilizations emerged from the ruins of Velrathi control. Many of them reached out to Earth, seeking alliance with the species that had shown them liberation was possible. Humanity accepted these partnerships and helped rebuild what the Dominion had destroyed. 3 centuries after the invasion, Earth had become the center of a vast alliance of free worlds. Human ships patrolled trade routes and protected the weak from the strong. Human diplomats mediated disputes between species that had been enemies for millennia. Human soldiers stood ready to defend any world that faced conquest. The lessons of the war were taught to every child across the alliance. They learned about the 12 heroes who had given their lives in the heart of the enemy flagship. They learned about the ordinary people who had found extraordinary courage when their world needed them. They learned that freedom was never free, but it was always worth fighting for. And when young aliens asked their elders why no one ever dared attack Earth, the answer was always the same. A single rule that every species in the galaxy understood: Earth is not yours to take. In Kansas, in the rebuilt heartland of America, a statue stood in a field of golden wheat. It showed a soldier looking up at the stars, rifle in hand, determination on his face. The inscription at the base was simple and direct: "We held the line." Visitors came from across the galaxy to see that statue. They stood in the shadow of the bronze soldier and tried to understand what had driven these soft, fragile beings to fight against impossible odds. Most of them left without answers, unable to comprehend a species that would simply refuse to lose. But the humans understood. They had always understood. Some things were worth dying for. And Earth was at the top of that list. The stars belonged to everyone now. But one small blue planet remained forever unconquered. It was home. It was sacred. And it would never fall.